the climate is controlled well in there. Pretty cold for Easter Sunday morning, isn't it? Good morning. I hope soon others will enter and we'll be able to complete the numbers we normally have, that we hope to have, expect to have here on this day, which is not any special compared to any other first day of the week, except in the mind's eye of most of our fellow Americans and people throughout the world, especially the Western world. So it has a significance for that reason, historically, if nothing else, and this incident has been observed a long time. And typically, if you're going to get people to church, it's going to be on Easter or at Christmas time, something like that. That's usually when you expect some who are not here. I hope we're not seeing, because of the constant attacks of the Marxists of China against us and our way of life by a number of methods, especially the virus that come right in. I hope that we're not seeing finally, in the aftermath of all of that attack last year, discouragement setting in our own ranks, and that those of our number who normally come will make an effort to do so, because discouragement is an easy thing to happen to somebody. It happens to all of us from time to time. We feel it. We know what it means to despair and not be enthusiastic, to lose our zeal, especially if we think it won't do any good. I hope that sort of mindset will not afflict any of us here and has not begun to do so. Those I read who have polled churches and religious people throughout this country over the last several months have pointed out that there is a very sad trend that has developed. In fact, there's some terrible consequences of the attack of the Chinese virus, and one of those is lack of church going. It's just the numbers have dwindled a lot, noticeably. Some think that they may not pick up again. We don't know. It's hard to predict what may occur in the future, but some congregations, and this is now not just among our people, but across the board, congregations will be shut down forever. That's possible. Hopefully that will not happen, but it is possible. So we are encouraged by our presence today. We mutually help each other. That's why we're here. That's the reason for our worship service. Two principal things: to praise God, which we do every first day of the week in particular, and at other times we come together and to exhort one another. And badly do we need that, don't we all? We all have to go out into our respective spheres of labor, into our own neighborhoods and into the places where we work and among our family and friends. And we just need the boost that can come only from our brethren when we get together, especially on the Lord's Day, as has been taught in Hebrews 10, verse 25. Today, I wanted us to continue looking at some of the material in my father's book. We looked at the article last time. We've been looking at it for a couple of times, at least, that had discussed the question of divorce in the United States. And I think we spent an adequate amount of time on that, unless there are some questions still hanging over our heads. If you have any, feel free to bring them up. Now, we're not that formal. We can always make time to try to address them. Any comments that you think are really appropriate that need to be made about that will benefit us all or benefit some, then feel free to do that as well. But having finished that up, as I said last time, may Christians drink wine. I skipped over that one on purpose because of the recent PowerPoint presentation on that subject. I say recent, it's been about a year, probably a little over a year, but it was here in this Bible class. Now, I'd used material like that previously, but here in this Bible class, we spent 2 or 3 weeks looking at the question of the Bible and alcoholic use. Now, if there are questions about that, you can raise those questions. I don't mean to overlook any of that. It's not like it's off limits. I just want us to move on and look at some other things. And then the page 38 is the one called Fortify the Whole that dealt with the marriage problem. Well, on page 40, he presents another one that written back in 1972, published in 72, that really is up to date still. The principles are the same kinds of things we face today. And you could just supply new headlines from what you saw yesterday on the news to what he mentions in the outset, where he talks about how in an interview, I guess it was, the parents of an accused would-be assassin of Alabama's Governor George C. Wallace expressed the kind of shock expected. Now, I remember that vividly when it happened, and was very saddened over it. At the time, I was not a huge George Wallace fan. Now I am. And I know some simplistic-minded people would say, ooh, that betrays a weakness in your character. But just as an aside, Governor Wallace was a very complex individual. He was not just single-layered. He was not everything you saw on the surface. A lawyer, I think, by training, I consider him to be a brilliant, brilliant statesman. Although he made mistakes, and he himself was the first to admit it eventually. And there are not many he'll do that. Not many who'll do that. Our governor now is running around the country talking about this new Georgia voter integrity law, and he's taking a lot of flack from Delta and Coca-Cola and the baseball industry and things like that. And boy, he's out there telling us why we need it. Sort of like I was telling Loretta earlier, I put my motorcycle in the shop last week, spent a lot of money on it. What was wrong with it? Oh, nothing. Just thought I needed to take it in for repairs. Got a new law in Georgia. Why? Oh, no reason. Maybe we ought to do it. So I say Alabama Governor Wallace was the sort of man who would admit stupidity and carelessness, whereas other governors do not. So I say all that about Wallace to say he was a very enigmatic person. I've heard some of his defenses. He went into the mouth of the lion many times. UCLA, I believe, you can find these lectures on the internet. They're video archived. And Q&A at the end. And boy, they didn't like him in places like California. It didn't matter because they couldn't deal with him. I mean, like I say, he was a bulldog of a debater. And they kept trying to make everything about race. But he kept saying everything is about freedom. It's about our individual liberty. States' rights. Oh, that's a buzzword. No, states' rights means states' rights. Oh, that's a buzzword for Jim Crow. No, it does. It's states' rights. It's states' rights. Anyway, that's enough of that. This is a guy who, I'm setting this stage a little bit, kind of expanding on my father's mention of George Wallace, to say how sad it was when, during his presidential bid, he was shot and, of course, became an invalid the rest of his life by a would-be assassin. So the assassins, or would-be assassins' parents were dismayed. I guess they were good people. They didn't know they had raised a monster, or a would-be monster. Anyway, it was beyond them to understand that their son was a suspect in so dastardly an act. Every normal parent can identify, in a sense, and feel deep sympathy for them in their bereavement. But it is a breakdown of communication and discipline in the home that is at the very root of the crime wave in our nation. So that was kind of a touchstone of the crime wave that was felt even then. It's still here. Probably a lot worse now than it was then. We just have found ways to soften the statistics, and we've been desensitized to them. But it's pretty bad then, and that was kind of a culminating act. Been going on during the 60s, some major assassinations that really brought our nation to its knees. While Paul dedicates the first 5 chapters of Ephesians to a discussion of God's eternal plan in His church, that is the main theme. When his thoughts turn to the training of children in chapter 6, his subject is the home. So this article is written to show our society is sick. It was then and it especially is now. And it's sick because the home itself is suffering. That's the point. And we've got to go back and shore up the home, where he quotes Ephesians 6:4, and you fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And he said, God never intended, nor is it possible, that the church should fulfill all the needs of the children as they relate to spiritual training. Now let's stop and let's just discuss that for a moment, or do some thought exercise. There's nothing wrong with the church engaging in the fact. We'd be remiss if we didn't try, right? And he's never saying the church shouldn't. Whenever a statement like these are made, there are some who seem to misunderstand the import. It's not to knock our Sunday school program. We should do everything we can to make these strong and vibrant. to make them successful. These are good programs. We have well-meaning brethren, I suppose most of them were, some might not have been, but back in the mid-20th century who came up with the idea there's no biblical authority for the Sunday school, therefore we are wrong to implement one because we're going beyond that which is written. We tried to point out that this, the simple answer to that is their instincts were right. We need to be finding Bible authority for all that we do. We agree. Who would disagree? They're no more conservative, quote unquote, than we are on that point. We need Bible authority for all what we do. Their labeling the Sunday school as unauthorized was misguided. It was mistaken because the Sunday school is authorized. Where do you find it authorized, Jesse? The Sunday school or anything like a Sunday school? Does it have to mention that word in particular?
No, obviously we're to study to show ourselves approved, and what a wonderful opportunity to do that.
Yeah. Is it the only way to teach? No. Used to be said, years ago, and there was a debate, my father's mentioned this before, I think it was at the debate, between a brother who's defending the Sunday school arrangement and an anti-brother who was against it. And the brother who was for the school asked him, he said, "Brother, is it right for the parents to talk to their children at home about the Bible?" Well, of course, that's a ridiculous question. Of course, it's good and proper. Okay, fine. Well, suppose they're talking about it Sunday morning just before they get into the car to go to church. He said, well, that's good. That's an appropriate time. Well, suppose they get into the car and they're still talking about the Bible and the parents are discussing biblical principles with their kids on the way to church. Oh, I suppose that's a good thing to do. Suppose that all the members' children are learning on the way to church. They're all doing fine until they get in the parking lot. As soon as they get out, it's unscriptural to continue the conversation. Now, how absurd can you be? It is absurd. Again, I say, maybe at the beginning their instincts were right when they were looking for, you got to have Bible authority. You have to have Bible authority. But they failed to see there is generic authority. You don't have to have it mentioned in so many words. The Sunday school. And another objection was the Sunday school was invented by Protestant denominations. Well, they might have invented stained glass windows and stuff. It's still pretty in some of our buildings. They might have gone in the front door and leave by the front door. Nothing wrong with that. Have a vestibule or even a steeple to indicate to the community it's a place of worship. Not that you have to have one. I'm thankful for that. But what I'm saying is there is generic authority for things. And they failed to see that. So I said all that to say this is a good program, our Sunday school, and we're part of it here. We're not doing anything wrong. And they are the losers, our anti-brethren, for not having the Sunday school arrangement. Hey, we need more. We need more such things, such opportunities as that. Well, his point is, while we all see the need for a Sunday school, the church has its role to be sure. But God planned the home as an institution for molding and framing the character of children. Now, why say things like this? Why was it necessary in 72 or necessary now? If you're trying to fix something, then it implies what? As we said about the governor a while ago, which you wouldn't admit, something was broke, right? So the way we're training our kids has not always been the best. We can always make improvement in that area. And this is what he's trying to get us to see, to do our very best to make sure we bring up our children in the nurture and in the admonition of the Lord. And too many homes were not doing that. And that would lead to, delinquency. And of course, we could expand on that now and see the major social problems that were just starting to be seen even then, especially after all these decades from the leftist implementation of the Great Society programs of war on poverty and things like that. Noble ideals, of course, right? The idea of helping people out of poverty, good thing to do. But the way they went about it was giving checks to young women, to be promiscuous and have kids out of wedlock, run the father out of the house. You're not involved in this picture. So what's predictably going to happen? Well, criminality, all kinds of problems among the youth, especially young boys, but all young girls get involved in that same cycle their mothers were in, their grandmothers. And look at what it does to a society, what it can do. What's the root problem? The root problem is not that there were people like George Wallace running around talking about the right of the states to have power closer to the people than way out there somewhere a long way off that's not responsive to the people. That's not the problem. The problem is sin. In this case, immorality. That's the problem. So what's the solution? Well, I just said the problem is what? So what's the solution? That's an obvious thing. It's Christianity. It's the cross of Christ. And who upholds the cross and who bears the teachings of the cross, hopefully in a true way, in society. And that's us, the church. And it begins in the home. He says, especially begins in the home. Every individual, every child learns in the home. So we made some bad mistakes, some bad turns along the way. And now we're starting to see now, by hindsight, just how that happened. Now, in the next paragraph, he mentioned some things. And I was wondering, at the time in 72, I was a young teenager. Yeah, I was a teenager. So he might have written this because I had killed a bird or something. I don't know. I did stuff like that when I was a kid. He says, the love of nature, a respect for the domain of life, and love for the God who made it all must be learned at a young and tender age. The home, in cooperation with the church and school, can and must provide such training. Failure to respect even the rights of birds as well as other animals when one is young often has a bearing upon attitudes in adulthood. So yeah, I probably killed a bird, and he was bemoaning the fact he hadn't taught me better. But if I did, he would have taught me better. We'd have had a conversation with a little bit of leather involved. I used to see stuff like that and I cringed because I thought, oh, animal rights nuts, PETA and all that stuff. Are there nuts out there in the left? Yes. When they want to give the same rights to animals that human beings have, they're not helping animals. They're hurting human beings. They're devaluing us and bringing us down to the level of animals. You could present whole lessons on this. If we had time, we could talk about from the very beginning, God intended for animals to serve man. Man is to have dominion over all the lesser creatures in the world. Now they're provided for food. Jesus himself ate fish. How do you eat a fish unless you're a really bold Japanese? You might eat one living. I've eaten living oysters. They're good right out of the half shell. But normally you eat fish by killing the fish. What? Well, I shouldn't have brought that up properly. It used to be habit of mine. I like raw oysters. But anyway, fish are animals. The last time I checked, they're in the animal kingdom, and he ate them. They ate the Passover lamb. And so the Bible's not opposed to just normal use of animals for man's benefit, domesticating the beasts so they'll pull plows and things of that nature, or wagons. So this is not a brief carried for nutty people who say animals are people too and stupid things like that. Yeah, Chris?
I don't know. A lot of folks don't know what animals are other than squirrels and cats and dogs. I mean, we don't really have very much exposure to nature anymore. I think that's part of the problem. We've become a consumer society. We just consume, and the things that we produce don't really have any value. They're either technical type jobs or informational. We just have a fake economy, basically. Even more so now because we're being paid to stay at home. People we're just, and we're aimless. We don't have anything to do. We don't have to tend animals. We don't have farms anymore. We don't actually have any kind of labor where we make things and see things being built with our hands. Everything is ephemeral, and so I feel like a lot of people they kind of just float along through life, and they don't have really any grounding to the world and nature, like your dad is saying here. And I think that's a huge part of the problem because, again, people just are disconnected from reality to a large degree, and it's not helpful, the things that have happened this last year. It just makes it amplified that much worse.
I think what you said reminded me of a passage in a book. I can't remember who the author was, who had been reared in New York City, I believe, Manhattan. And he had a relative way out in the country in Kansas or something and got sent out in the summer to spend some weeks, there. His first exposure to country living. And the biggest exposure, he pointed out, was seeing animals that would die on the farm. He'd never actually experienced death up close and personal. And he said it was a good lesson that summer. He learned some of the things you're talking about, what reality's like, that there will be an end, death, and so on, and value of hard work. So, it reminded me of that. And it's a good point. We talk about such things as is it right to go hunting? Well, the Bible speaks about that. Chris could probably look this up. There's a passage in the wisdom literature, either in Ecclesiastes or Proverbs, where he says, I think it says, the sluggard roasteth not that which he taketh in the hunting. In other words, he kills an animal, but he's too lazy to prepare that meat to be used for the family, which is good and proper. You can kill an animal, shoot a deer, for example, and venison is excellent meat, good for you, it's good to eat. But if you just shoot deer and let them rot in the woods, that's wrong. That's not good stewardship. When I was a kid, I'd see a bug in the yard. And of course, first thing you do is run and step on it, step on a bug. And if I see it in the house, I still do that. But when I'm in the yard now and I see a bug, I usually just let it go. That's where it belongs, I guess when you get older, I don't know if you're getting more mellow or if you're just starting to appreciate God's creation. God made insects to live in places like the outdoors, in the woods. So, we could spend a lot of time talking about that because there is this strange, aberrant idea that animals are people. That's just ridiculous. And it really is an effrontery to the biblical teaching about man made in the image of God. Proverbs 12:27, us the slothful man and not sluggard, roasteth not that which he took in the hunting, but the substance of a diligent man is precious. So maybe one day we could have a whole study in Proverbs. That'd be a helpful thing to do. But we'll finish up this study, this training, by going through this book and learning some content of the sorts of things that might come up. Now, we won't necessarily discuss hunting issues while we're in a personal work setting. We might, but most of the time we'll be talking about other big questions, and these are the kinds of questions that are mentioned here. The problems with society, such as the high crime rate, those problems came from not being taught in the home. The home was failing, still is failing. The home, in cooperation with the church and school, can and must provide such training. Failure to respect even the rights of birds is, okay, I've already read. This is one reason property rights are considered non-existent by a radical element in society. Well, that radical element's in the White House now, of course, and they control every echelon of government. I think probably 5 years ago, the die was cast, I believe, when there had been a major purging of the military, don't you think? Under a previous administration, not the one before this quote-unquote administration. But I think under Obama, there were so many purges of the military. Now it's a left-wing military. The top brass, I believe, are all far out in left field, causing great problems. I hear from enlisted men and officers of lesser rank having a hard time dealing with that, the woke Army and so on, Air Force especially. Well, we see radical elements. We saw them then, and then they were out, at the time protesting in the streets or on campuses, and now they occupy the halls of power, and they have very few reasons to respect property rights. Now, what's that all about? You mentioned property rights. You don't want to get into a discussion of politics in a Bible class per se. There's overlapping because you are talking about the fact God made man to have dominion over the world. That in itself implies property, that you have some little sphere of this earth cut out for you, or that you can cut out for yourself. If you have a right to it, it's not you're not encroaching on somebody else's right, that you can go and you can develop that piece of property so that it produces and there's something to eat, something over your head, make a roof out of the trees that are there. So it's the kind of thing, return to nature, Chris is talking about, that would be so helpful if we had to do that maybe for a year or so.
It reminds me of the parable of talents. God, in the same sort of way, God has given us the earth and He's given us all these things, and it's up to us to take and to make them better.
Be good stewards.
Not to just, take and be lazy.
Yeah, right.
Not cultivate. So.
Well, we all agree, the caricature of the hard left about anybody who's traditional American today is that we all want to pollute the streams, and pollute the air and throw garbage around everywhere. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The mere use of these resources in the world, even coal and things like that, does not mean we have disrespect for Mother Earth, as we say. It means we just want to use them, be wise stewards of those things. And now the reason this matters, and it's kind of a convoluted thing, I won't go very far with this, just mention a couple of points and we'll move on, is because the far left denies property rights. Now, who has been saying things like that? Well, people like Karl Marx. He's not the first, but those far leftists like Karl Marx denied the right of private property. That's why they're against capitalism, the right of private capital or the ownership of things other than by collectively everybody. So if everybody owns it, then nobody really owns it. You can't own it. It belongs to everybody. So we have people like Karl Marx and others who have denied the right of private ownership of property. And all this entails, Marxism rests on that major premise that there should not be any effort to have private property. You know, a little parcel of ground where you provide for your family, as I illustrated a while ago. But we realize that too is based on an atheistic worldview, because the biblical worldview is completely the opposite worldview. So Marxism has distorted the biblical worldview altogether. That's why we mention things like that, property rights. And
I was going to mention that, I mean, he may say that, but he doesn't really mean that it belongs to everybody. It belongs to
the state,
the people that are in control.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Yeah.
always
Well, it belongs to the state, but the state, as it's manifested by the Comintern, and like you said, the people in control, the small cadre. That's exactly what we're seeing trying to be implemented today, and to a large extent being implemented in many aspects of our society. True. So it's all a farce anyway. They don't really believe that. They don't really believe in collectivism. It's still elitism. It's just a different group of elite people. It's like when Fidel Castro came to power, there were capitalists who owned factories. Hershey's. I've been by the Hershey's factory there in Hershey's, Cuba. There's a Hershey's there. I've seen the old mill there where they would process the sugar cane, send it back to Hershey, Pennsylvania. You know, there were sister towns. Of course, then when the communists took over, they took that away, the private property away from the Hershey's, and the Castroites mainly owned it. I mean, the people who were followers of Castro. The state took it over and ran it. It was theirs. They just robbed it at the point of a gun, or many guns, robbed it, took it to their own, and then tried to hallow that, taking that theft up by these noble-sounding terms like collectivism and the rights of the society and that sort of stuff, you know, against exploitation. Well, they're the biggest exploiters of all. It is a farce. We recognize it. But that's the way the devil has always operated. He's always operated on the big lie. It seems like the bigger the lie, the more people fall for it. I think Hitler said that, wasn't it? Reportedly. I don't know. But
You know, now that you mention that, you know, the devil, what was his purpose? Was his purpose to really, you know, when he was talking to Eve, was he really trying to, you know, free her from God?
yeah, he promised liberty.
Or was he trying to enslave her to his own?
Good point. He promised her liberty, you know, freedom that she was, you know, shackled by this rule. You can't eat of that fruit. Promised her liberty. But of course, in the end, what she got, and all of us, we all got, because Adam sinned, slavery. And we sinned. We got slavery to sin. And that's like, well, that is the macrocosm, I guess, of the many microcosms that happen every day with the communists. They promise freedom from a tyrannical system, you know, a racist, hateful, endemically racist system as this one. You know, get rid of it so that we can go to these leftist programs and everybody will be free. But as a matter of fact, that's not what happens. They rob us. Many books have been written on that. It kind of reminds me of several I've been reading in the last few months by some Christian authors. James D. Bell is one of our brethren. Years ago, he used to write a lot on this subject. And even then, I don't think it was very popular, but he did a great service to the brotherhood by putting this stuff in print, kind of chronicling as it was happening the inroads communism was making in many parts of the world. And he was constantly anti-communistic. And he pointed out, this is not the political side of communism. You can't separate it in a sense because you're dealing with ultimate worldviews. Either in the beginning God, or in the beginning dialectical materialism. You got to make your choice. They've made their choice, and the consequences are radically different from those who start with in the beginning God. So these are worldview pictures, broad issues. But he would deal with these things, and I think we've, I guess, been lulled into a false sense of security, especially when our government at one time ostensibly was against communism. We even had young men to go and give their lives in places like Vietnam, earlier Korea, to stop the onslaught of communism. That was the attempt. And then now it's been wholesale adopted by so many of our public figures. Anyway, let's go back and look at that point. He mentions how they deny property rights. This is why public speakers, especially politicians, and in some instances, preachers of the word, do not find a respectful and polite audience. In other words, a general disdain for authority. Now, there's a difference between authority and authoritarianism, I think. Don't you see? I don't like authoritarianism or despotism or tyranny. You know, the whole idea of the arbitrary authority of some group of men or one man over so many others, as you have in most systems of government in the world. But there is legitimate authority. It's in the home. God instituted the home. The parents are to have authority over the children at home. We love our kids, and as they get older, they become sometimes close friends of ours. But we've got to be careful when they're little about making them our best friends. They don't need a best friend when they're little. They need a mother and a daddy. Then when they grow up, then they're your best friend. So that's how they become your best friend, because you were mother and daddy. They need that authority in the home, but not authoritarianism, not despotism. There's a difference. We don't want to provoke our children to wrath, of course. So we're trying to teach the right kind of attitudes. And when they grow up insulting their mother and their father, then they'll grow up insulting their teachers in school and getting away with it. And then they'll grow up insulting legitimate leaders, especially conservative leaders. Today we see like traditionalists who stand for mom, dad, and the kids and the home and natural marriage and things. They have total disrespect for that. And it just gets worse and worse. Far too few parents look upon their children as gifts from the Lord, hence no sense of divine stewardship exists. They are treated as a biological accident whose existence is more easily tolerated when they are out of our hair. Now, how are such kids so frequently born into society? I mean, why? We know how, but why is it that so many kids are born into society today of this nature who are treated as an accident that they were not planned for, not wanted? What's the problem behind that usually? Sometimes it happens in a marriage, a surprise. They didn't mean for the child to be born now. But usually people, a mother and a father who love each other, a husband and wife, usually also naturally love the kids, even if they weren't planned for. But people who are promiscuous and who are having relations outside of wedlock would certainly view that as an inconvenience to have a pregnancy to ensue from that and a child to be born. So kids are just mistreated. It's pitiful. We go to the inner cities in our country today and throughout much of the industrialized world. You see so many neighborhoods where the kids they don't know who their father is. They don't care. Their mother, she's not necessarily been a paragon of virtue, not taught them the right thing. And what does this do to the society as a whole? It destroys the culture. Eventually, it can cause a whole nation to topple. That certainly can happen. Society is sick, he said. But now he wants to explain what he does not mean about that in a few sentences. Because even the leftists are saying that today. Oh yeah, I agree. Society is sick. Why? Because it's always been racist to the core. Racist, racist, racist. What does that mean? Well, it just means bad people. Well, who are they? The ones who disagree with our politics. Bad people. Racists. Sick. Well, that's not what he's talking about. The Word of God affirms it and observation confirms it. The whole world lieth in wickedness. The whole world lieth in darkness until now. The new morality, and we mentioned that last time, I think, underscores the truth of John's inspired statement. In other words, the promiscuity that was being promulgated, being endorsed, up until that time it was looked upon with a frown generally for people. People did it. It happened. We're not going to fool ourselves. There was immorality even in the 50s. Sometimes a lot of it in some places. But at least society as a whole frowned upon it. That was the public image. We frowned upon it. Then in the 60s, everything completely changed. While we do not agree with all of the connotations inherent in the charge of a sick society as used by liberals of this country, only the deliberately blind fail to see that we are in trouble as a nation, and all the ignorant deny the connection between our national problems and old-fashioned sin. Now, is there a one-to-one correspondence? So I mentioned that earlier in this session. I've mentioned a bunch of times. Is there a one-to-one correspondence between individual sin in the life of an individual, and national despair, national calamity? Well, what's the nation made out of? It's just a collection of individuals. And to the extent the individuals have gone rotten, what happens to the collective whole? Well, that's obvious. It doesn't take a great political scientist to understand this, does it? If most people in a country, or a large number, are really bad people, really, really bad, as some used to say, talking about, especially about the news media, they're really bad. If that happens, then pretty much the whole society is suffering. And if a society suffers too much, it could die. And when it dies, then its territory is replaced by somebody else, something else, sometimes completely alien to what was once there. We may find scapegoats in our political and judicial leaders. Well, we shouldn't be looking for scapegoats in that figure of speech. It's taken from the Bible, the Old Testament, but that figure of speech of the scapegoats has to do with trying to unnecessarily blame somebody who may not be at fault. When it's all our fault in a way. All our fault. And, I started to get back on my hobby horse again. I better be careful. Talking about the public schools. Most of my life I went to public schools. My kids all went to the public schools. They graduated from the public schools. I'm not opposed to the idea of public education per se, but what happens if public education is taken over by a radical element that does not respond favorably to the pleadings of the parents? Parents who are traditional minded, believe in God and the Bible and Jesus. What if those who are the educators don't accept those points of view and they're willing to cram down the throats of these impressionable young students their far left ideas, their atheistic ideas in many cases, Darwinism? What happens eventually to the whole society? We get them in Sunday school, 30 or 40 minutes. I've mentioned this so many times, and just a few hours a week at best. And they have them multiple hours on in days at a time, 5 days a week usually. They have them inculcating these ideas. So somebody can say, well, the problem was not the arrangement of a public school per se. No, that's not the problem of public education per se. It's who got in charge of public education. The radicals took over. I would say, though, if you look back at the history of it, the radicals were there at the very beginning of the public education movement in this country. People like John Dewey, he was no friend of Christianity. One of the earliest, father of modern American education. No friend at all of traditional morality either. These people were already there waiting in the wings, so when they began to consolidate the school, that's the way my parents would put it, they consolidated the school. He always told me Temple was the first consolidated school in America. That's what he remembers from his youth. That may be the case. I hadn't looked it up. Temple was the first consolidated school, however you define that. In other words, this is the beginning of what we call the public school system. Instead of the one-room schoolhouse, sort of privately funded and by parents in the community, you go to government funding. Seems like an okay idea. The money comes from taxes, right? Government money, tax money, it's our money. But who's now in charge of the spending of that money? Well, we leave it to people whose worldviews are very different from ours. What are the solutions? Well, you could have your kids all to be truants, and not many people go after you. Not many go after them anymore. I think Kamala Harris used to do that a lot. She liked to go after the truants. Really irked people in L.A. County, in L.A., I believe. That's funny to see. All the people who still hate her because she put parents in jail, threatened to do so because their kids were out goofing off, playing hooky. But that's not a good alternative. We want them to learn. Or we could have private schools, and that costs millions. It literally costs millions. And I also went to a private school. I'm thankful to I graduated from Greater Atlanta Christian School in Norcross. But what's the problem with private schools besides the money? What's happened to GACS? I'll say this publicly about my alma mater. I'll say this publicly. The leftists took it over. Why do we always let that happen? Conservatives usually begin these movements. They're the ones who are most zealous to have a Christian school where you get away from the lunatics that you have in the public system. You can get around peaceful people who believe in Christianity. So you get there and you start that, and then you have a very good program. Usually you have a program that's academically better than most of the public schools, and for obvious reasons. People really care about these schools. They want to make them work. The parents help the kids with the homework. The kids do well in that kind of environment, and they take away all the prices in the debate team and even sometimes in sports and so on. Then people get their covetous eye on those kinds of schools. So that's when they come out of the woodwork and they start ensconcing themselves into our schools. The next thing you know, they crowd out the original conservatives that began them and say, we don't need you anymore, and you're out on the street. And they take them over. And everything's lost, and you got to start from scratch. That's the second alternative. But the third one would be, I guess, homeschooling. And I'm probably the world's worst at this, and I feel bad about it, by making fun of homeschool kids. You can always tell a homeschool kid, laughing at. That's not right. That's not right. We need to be careful about that. I believe in homeschool. I believe in also public schools. And then the fourth way, and this is the way I guess we try to do it, is what you'd call compensatory training once they get out of school. They go to school and learn the arithmetic that I can't teach too well. I was never good at that at home. And they learn that stuff, but then when they come back, I want to go back and see what they learned in social studies. And ask the kids, what are they telling you in science class? Let's talk about that. And they may learn a lot of good stuff in science. There's a lot of good stuff taught, but then there's some bad things. Let's find out what it is and say, no, that's not right, and show why. What I call compensatory class. So you can do that too. It's kind of like a combination of public school and homeschooling. What's wrong with that? But the point is, we've got to make an effort to train our kids and not let it be done by others who are living by taxpayer money who do not answer to us. Parent-teachers associations are just big jokes that I've seen over my experience. They rarely get much done. They're just token meetings, and most of the time the teachers' administration really could care less what parents think. Unless you make a lot of noise, they might try to appease you. But we've got to do something to stop this sick society stuff. We may find scapegoats in our political and judicial leaders, but the problems of sick society are born in the home. That's the main point. Liberal leaders can do little in their attempts to warp the mind of a properly trained child. What does Proverbs chapter 22, verses 6 and 15 say? Oh yeah, train up a child in the way he should go. When he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, what is a proverb? A proverb is a general statement. It's a truism that's most of the time the case. Are there ever exceptions to Proverbs? Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child. I wouldn't say that about Jesus of Nazareth when he was a child, when he was like 12. He didn't seem to be a foolish type of child. Most of us were. Most of us are just kids are kids, Foolishness is just what we are when we're selfish and we're self-centered. But the rod of correction shall drive it far from. By the way, what's the rod of correction?
First thing is you have to love them. And if you love them, you're not going to mistreat them, and you're not going to teach them things that will hurt them and hurt society.
Well, that's a great point.
One of the best examples of education without morality is Germany and the Nazis that took over there. They had a brilliant society as far as intellectually, but they turned it into one of the most evil societies that's ever been.
Great
With
points.
their hatred of other people,
Very good points. I appreciate that. And of course, love is the motive. And even when we pull out that rod that he mentions, why would you do that? Because you love them. You love them. You really. And if you don't correct them when they need it, you don't love them to the extent you should. That's the point that the Proverbs writers make. I know that's ancient. I know it comes from an antiquated book in the minds of many, the Bible. And it's not popular today, but that's true. And had that been going on in Hitler at Germany, in the right way for the right reasons, maybe all of that would. You're exactly right. That's a good analysis of what happened in Germany. Let's see. I think I saw you first.
I was going to add, the Proverb also says that he that spareth the rod hates his child. So if you want to get really detailed, I forgot what it is, but I remember hearing that as well. It goes right along.
Well, he mentions that several times. I think at least 3 or 4 times
If
about.
you don't love them like you should, well, outright says you hate them.
And I think of a rod. Normally, we think of a rod as a stiff thing that will break your bones, but I think it's more like a switch. Probably when you say, I would think that's probably the soft way to view it, as a switch. Switches are not soft.
Well, you think about I Are we thinking about in terms of like a shepherd's rod?
I don't know that he means take a shepherd's rod and beat a child with it. I mean,
No, I mean, but you can correct the child. You can like you know a sheep's going the wrong way. You have the rod.
no, it's not that, because the other passages that Jesse mentioned, if we could find them, they mentioned beat him, he will not die. You will beat him and he will live. Let's find that, if you can look that. I think it's in a proverb. Even though you beat him, he will not die. So it's talking about using the rod for corporal punishment, not just nudging them along like sheep. I know somebody might try to, they'd love to bring that up, I think, but that won't fit what was said. No, it's using the rod for corporal punishment. I have to tell this story. I probably tell every time we get on the subject. I remember Loretta got in trouble. My mother said, "Son, go get me a switch. I'm going to have to whip her." So I ran in the yard and climbed a tree and took a hacksaw, got to the top of the tree, and I cut off the last 15 or 20 feet of the top of the tree. It was a straight tree. And I brought in a rod. It's like from here to that door. I said, "Here it is." And she said, "Thank you, son." And she laid it down, went in the yard, brought in a little switch. She spanked Loretta, then she picked up the big rod, and I got it. I got the whipping with it. I had to laugh, even though it hurt. I thought, this is still funny. I mean, it's sort of like when Don Rickles insults you. It's still funny. But all right, did you find it? Yeah. Yeah, chasteneth him. So you chasten him with a rod. But there is one I think says, beat him, though, and he will not die, I think.
It's worse when you have to chasten the kids, though. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
If you run,
You have to be willing to chase them
If
down.
you're having to chase them,
If you don't love them.
chase.
Yeah.
My daddy tells me I did that too a lot. And I think he just nailed my foot to the floor, and eventually it was just easy to. I'm just kidding. He didn't really do that. He wasn't like a friend of mine who used to tell his kids to be quiet or he'd rip off their arms and beat them over the head with a bloody end. Good friend of mine. He didn't mean it. Well, anyway, this is the point, training in our home. Go ahead, Jesse. Go ahead.
I was going to say, it's sad that we're ashamed of that kind of correction in America today. And as you mentioned earlier, secularism was frowned upon in the 50s, even though it's, it was things were a lot better then.
Yeah.
At least we frowned upon things. Somewhere along the way, we've become ashamed to frown upon things. I remember we bullied feminine boys in school. When I was in school, we kind of bullied them and made fun of them. You act like a girl, and it worked. It really did work for the most part, but
Shame them into acting
picking
like a
children,
man.
innocent children up that were just smaller, we can throw them in the trash cans. I never saw that happen. I never did, but they got us too small to school. But as
What?
far as
I didn't.
bullying,
That's
it
a
works.
good idea. What
We
you?
frown upon things, it works.
Oh, pick them up, throw them in a trash can.
Well, they deserve it. Harmless.
It's sort of like Ernest said. Ernest saves Christmas. Why would anybody throw away a perfectly good dog? In the garbage can.
We need to frown. That's what I'm trying to point out. We don't frown upon things. We're ashamed to frown upon things.
Well, it all has to do with our fundamental belief system has changed. You see, if you believe God's word, Scripture, that it is God's word, and that it's true, and it never leads us astray on what it affirms, if you really believe that, as many used to, even though you don't live right necessarily, you still respect what it says, and your point of view is going to be, yeah, I agree with that. I agree. But today, the consensus is not that the Bible is the Word of God. It's hard to even look up any simple fact you're trying to find about the Bible on the internet. If you get directed to Wikipedia or something, you're going to get all kinds of nonsense out there. It's just so many very hateful people who don't like the Bible are incessantly publishing. We've got to do more to counteract that and put out stuff ourselves. But that's the problem. There's no censure against that behavior because there's no consensus that it's wrong. I mean, who are you to judge? The liberals would be right, I guess, although inconsistent when they say you can't judge it. If there is no God, I mean, by what standard would you tell somebody that homosexuality is wrong? If that's their practice, they like it, leave them alone. That's the way they'd view it, of course. Of course, the dyed-in-the-wool evolutionists would say it's not helpful for the ongoing of the evolution of the species, so maybe we ought to ban it as in some communist countries, I think they do, for that reason. Well, I appreciate your comments. Any more questions or comments? We try to get stopped in a timely fashion. y'all.